جمال الوجود بذكر الإله.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تكونوا كالذين آذوا موسى فبرأه الله مما قالوا وكان عند الله وجيها. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. إنا عرضنا الأمانة على السماوات والأرض والجبال فأبين أن يحملنها وأشفقن منها وحملها الإنسان إنه كان ظلوما جهولا. ليعذب الله المنافقين والمنافقات والمشركين والمشركات ويتوب الله على المؤمنين والمؤمنات وكان الله غفورا رحيما. صدق الله العظيم.
تكبير. ما شاء الله. May Allah protect him. إن شاء الله ربنا بيجعله من حافظين ومتقين وعلماء الدين. Next we have Sister Sufia, our secretary of the GAIS board, and she's going to share some information with you about the grant that Brother Zafar announced the first night. Sister Sufia.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. You know, on Sunday at the opening, I said my heart was full. And today, it's only been one full day, right? My head is full. So I think you might be feeling that same way. We had, mashallah, we opened with Professor Abdullah, a wonderful keynote by him. And then the sessions throughout, and there's so much to learn, not just from the speakers, but from each other, that really, there's so much up here that I hope you're all organizing it somehow, however you do it, whether it's writing it down in notebooks or making spreadsheets or whatever it might be, because we don't want to lose all of the information that we've been gathering, and we need to sort it out and see how we can use it as we leave here. So the next, today and then tomorrow, there's going to be a lot more coming your way. So find a way to keep track of everything. I won't take too much time. I'm going to talk a little bit. Brother Zafar mentioned to you that GIS, alhamdulillah, we have received a grant from the Islamic Development Bank. It does not cover anything related to the conference, by the way. So this is all on us. It's all through registration and sponsorships and donations and so on. But the bank is supporting us to build capacity. And what that means is, a few of the things that we wanted to do and they're going to support us on is having a robust, user-friendly website where we can upload and provide all the resources that, in the WhatsApp groups, some of you are on the groups, you see so much coming through. People talking about, the services they offer, the books that they publish, articles that they've read and seen. And we need to be able to kind of have a place where we can access everything, somewhere where everything's organized, somewhere we can find, all the things that are being shared need to be in one place. So the website is one thing that they're helping us support. And along with that is a conference app. Now, you know that some of you have been using, most of you, I think, have been using WOVA. It takes a little while to get used to, but I think it's pretty user-friendly. I don't know. I have to admit, I haven't used it as much maybe as some others. But we're going to be supported on that as well through the bank. So the website and an app that kind of align together, so that in the future, as we do this annual conference, inshallah, and we hope also to do some regional events, all the information that's collected, that's shared, will be in one place for you, for everyone, not just you who attend, but for anyone all over the world to be able to come there and be able to access it without a fee. It won't be, inshallah, won't be behind a paywall. It'll be there for everyone, for our ummah to use, inshallah. So that's two things. And then the third item they're supporting us with is a peer learning and knowledge sharing component. And we're going to be defining that a little bit more. It may involve hosting regional conferences or trainings, or having school leaders visit schools in other countries to learn from them. So this just happened to us fairly recently, so we're still working our way through. But I would like to stress one of the important things for us to tell you about is that it's not just a grant and here, go use it. It's a grant that we also have to contribute towards. And as you have heard Brother Zafar mention, and maybe you'll hear more tonight, maybe at the gala, is what we're looking for is support from all of you. We don't have fees that we charge our members. There is a registration fee for the conference, but really, as you see what's provided here, we are not able to pay for all the services that we provide in the conference through registration fees alone. So we are going to be asking for some financial support from you so that we can access these grant funds. Brother Abdul Warsami from the bank is having a session tomorrow on different ways that the bank supports Muslim communities. 2:45 tomorrow in Moonstone, which is the meeting room right over there to my right. And you'll have an opportunity to ask him about questions about how, there might be ways that the bank can support your work, your countries, in the societies, and so on. So that's just a little bit more about the bank. I don't want to take too much time away from our keynote speaker for today. So if you have maybe one or two questions about this grant that GIS has received, I can take a few now, and you'll learn more about the bank and their processes tomorrow. Anything? Teachers are told to wait, I don't know, maybe 10 seconds before moving on, because somebody might have a question and might wait a little bit more to ask. But if there are no questions, inshallah, what I'm going to do is ask Brother Fahad to come up and introduce our keynote speaker for today, inshallah. Oh, one more thing. I stand corrected. Something I said Sunday. I said that the people who came from the US traveled the most, and it was not the people from the East Coast. And I said it was the people from Texas, from the central region. I stand corrected. There's someone here from California. I don't know if you're in the room, but that would be the farthest anyone traveled. There you are, from California, inshallah. So about 10,000 miles. Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. In our Hadith tradition, one of the most prized honor for anyone in the Hadith tradition is to introduce their teacher. So I have the honor of introducing my teacher, Dr. Abdullah Sahin. Inshallah, he's going to give the keynote address today, and you'll shortly see the topic as well. Dr. Sahin is a member of the Warwick Religious and Education Research Unit at the University of Warwick. He's involved in collaborative projects across the department, focused on critical and comparative pedagogy, interdisciplinary study of education in cross-cultural settings, and empirical research projects integrating psychology of religion and education studies. Dr. Sahin comes from an Islamic studies, theology, educational studies, and social sciences background. He has conducted research on religious identity formation among British Muslim youth and worked on educational strategies to address the impact of religious extremism within Muslim minority and majority contexts. Dr. Sahin developed the first recognized master's level degree program on Islamic education within the UK higher education system. He is taught at the universities of Birmingham, Aberdeen, and the Gulf Universities for Science and Technology in Kuwait. Before taking up his appointment at Warwick, Dr. Sahin worked as head of research and senior lecturer at the Markfield Institute of Higher Education. He served as a visiting professor at the Institute of Islam at the Sociétés du Monde Musulmane at the École des Hautes Études in Sciences Sociales. Oh. Yeah, pardon my French. Yeah, Paris. Dr. Sahin is a member of the International Seminar on Religious Education and Values and has recently been appointed as a visiting professor at the UIN State Islamic University, Jakarta, Indonesia. Thank you, Dr. Sahin, for joining us at this conference. We look forward to hearing from you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah ala din al-Islam wa tawfiq al-Iman. Wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. It's very difficult to follow the act from one of your students who is actually knowledgeable enough to be actually our teacher as well. I'm very fortunate at Warwick to work with Sheikh Imtiaz, who is with us here as well, another both student and teacher, and of course Sheikh Harun. What I would like to share with you this morning is kind of a personal reflection as well as professional reflection on this year's major theme. And I will share some of my experiences being involved in research in Islamic education, originally within Muslim minority context of UK, a research that we have replicated in Muslim majority contexts. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed me to work on the same theme to develop actually a professional development study program at the University of Warwick to be able to empower, resource, and help advance essentially educational infrastructure within our communities. So I'm going to be talking about really what Tajdid is, and my analysis will be educationally framed. Remember, yesterday we have heard a lot. Tajdid is a well-known concept, but in Islamic tradition, legal sciences takes precedent. It's always the queen of the sciences. So fiqh, usul fiqh, has framed this concept, but I would make a humble challenge to that by saying that, well, actually, it's an educational concept, primarily. And I'll explain why I think it is an educational concept. And then I'll try to get the center, really, of my message to you this morning. Yet again, I'm very humbled to address so many practitioners in the field from different parts of the world. Jazakumullah khair again for GIS to gather us together. And you will obviously, hopefully, react to see to what extent my narrative, my story makes sense to you, inshallah. And that is what really, how do we actualize, implement, embed, integrate compassionate, transformative educational heritage in our faith. And I explain why I believe educational heritage in Islam is transformative. This is not like a fancy Western educational concept. It has some evidence base in our faith. And why this transformative education, unlike contemporary secular Western education, which is materialistic, sadly, and selfish, pragmatist, achievement-focused, outcome-focused technology, in Islam, it is a compassionate act of caring, actually. So I'll explain why this is the case. Why do we believe that we have such an ideal in our faith? Right. And hopefully that will come through towards the end of my talk. So here's the outline. So what is Tajdid? Obviously, we've got to get the basics. And then why I think Tajdid is a critical educational concept, as well as a pedagogical praxis indicating concept. You know, in English, the word praxis, it's different from practice. And those who've studied education, social sciences would know. It is essentially bringing theory into practice at the same time. So in our idiom, Islamic idiom, The Quran says, آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا. Quran never says, آمَنُوا and stop. آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا. That is, really have an awareness of what are you subscribing to, committed to, think, nazar, but also actualize, practice. So really praxis, although it's a fancy word, but it has its origins within faith traditions, prophetic faith traditions. Now we will link this. Why do we need such a renewal at Tajdid? We got to acknowledge that there is a crisis. We have heard yesterday a little bit about the challenges facing Islamic schooling in minority context, but also education itself is really a problem within Muslim majority context. This is not, we don't have to really self-blame those who are living in the minority context. Education in Muslim world still is faltering, sadly. And then I would share what I think would be a Tajdid embedded, impactful intervention would look like. Because essentially we need practical solutions to be able to implement in our educational infrastructure, that is institutions, teachers, leadership, and resources. So that brings me to the final point as to why I believe all Islamic education institutions, setups, spaces need to have, in my view, a Tajdid spirit embedded within their overall learning and teaching culture. Because I believe that the crisis goes back to having a very stagnant culture of learning and teaching. We have to make that dynamic so that transformation could come through. And then hopefully there will be some time for question and answer. So first, those who don't know me and those who know, apologies, a bit of repetition, who this person is, Dr. Sahin or Shahin. There's a bit of a dilemma going on, confusion, identity crisis maybe. Who is this voice? So my story and how I ended up in Warwick. Currently, I run Warwick Islamic Education Studies program. I'm very fortunate that I've actually kind of really almost coined this term, Islamic Education Studies, in struggle and debate with our colleagues in Islamic studies. They always assume that Islamic studies, Islamic education are the same. Really, they are not the same, actually. So Islamic education has actually an overall framework. Study is part of it, essentially. So I lead on a short PGA course, which is online available, and a PG certificate in Islamic education. And then we have a full MA. And now currently we are developing an IPGCE, that is a teacher training, internationally delivered PGCE teacher training. And I believe that in Muslim minority context, in Europe and America, and Africa as well actually, we don't have Muslim teacher qualification framework developed. This is a massive need. And we are hoping at Warwick that we are going to, inshallah, pioneer this as well, with efforts of my students, Harun and Sheikh Imtiaz, who are here today with us. So what is the point of these Warwick Islamic Education Studies? What is the end game? What is the interest? So the idea is to facilitate positive change through compassionate, transformative education. So change should come within. It should make sense to our values. It should inspire us within. It can't be imposed from outside. And that really can only be facilitated, in my view. It could be done in many ways. It cannot be done properly if you don't have a research informing the practice, the change. So I call this enabling research-based reflective practice in Islamic education settings. And if you get that infrastructure right, the chances are we could change society and our students. And we disseminate our key mottos, goals from the Quran. We have heard one yesterday. I'm very glad Sheikh Harun at least retaining one idea from Warwick. That is the ta'aruf, readiness, desire to learn from each other. And that is the crucial point. As an ummah, we are diverse. We have to recognize this diversity within ourselves first. And that's why we need organizations like GIS to create a synergy with an ummah that is sadly, tragically paralyzed with artificial borders, artificial, essentially, differences. We got to get that ummah's energy, inshallah, concentrated, a synergy that can only be achieved, obviously, if we have such collaborative activities. And finally, my biggest concept, which was really my own discovery for my own journey, personal journey, is the concept of tarbiyah. I'm sure it is familiar to all of you, Turkish-speaking, Urdu, Farsi. They all know this concept, but I bet not many people actually take time to reflect what it is. Through my research, I was forced to do that. Alhamdulillah, thank God I did that. And it really changed my own view of being a Muslim and understanding Islam in an educational term. So the word tarbiyah actually is not a simple nurture as people assume. It is nurturing of something, and that is compassionate, transformative flourishing. Now, I will explain why this is the case. In Islamic, obviously, tradition, we have a sub-tradition sciences called ta'arifat, or ilm al-hudud, ilm al-had, defining key concepts. Without defining concepts, we don't have a field. If we can't define our core inclusive concept of education, we can't have an Islamic education studies. But I will explain why tarbiyah actually contains the meaning of care, compassion, but change, transformation. It has to be. Hence, criticality, critical reflectivity. So bear with me. The entire project was based on small British Muslim family trusts. I'm very lucky to work with them. Without connecting with your community, whatever you do, obviously, it will be external. So I work with Randri Trust particularly. I really convey my thanks to this small family, originally from South Africa, but they are based in London, and they believe in the power of education to bring us together, particularly Islamic education. Kosaraf, Aziz Foundation, and last but not least, Nida Trust. And through Nida Trust, I also acknowledge my debt to inspiring figure that with us today, Idris Khamisa, Jazakallah khair. You also have an input in what I do. Okay, so what is enough for me? What is Tajdid? I did mention about the sponsors because without getting people believe in your vision, sharing a community, what you do, it will be interesting to you, but it have no social consequences. And we have to really make education ummatic, that is a social enterprise. And therefore, we got to have space for people to say, yes, I recognize this is a need. I can also support and sponsor. We have to create that desire in our communities as well. So what is Tajdid? We have heard the Arabic concept, obviously renew, revive, restore. I would also say reform, although it's a bit of a loaded concept, in the sense that in English, when we say we want to reform something, right, we assume that the current form is faulty. So reform actually is not really a bad word in this sense, because we want to reform ourselves, our societies, in the image, values of our tradition, because we believe something gone wrong. In this sense, it's close to the concept of Islah, continuous reform. Islah is really the method of actualizing Tajdid, gradual change. It also has the meaning, so when you reform something or renew something, right, it's an act of repetition. You have to obviously recognize it is an act of return. This is where, unfortunately, we all have to be kind of adopting Salafi method with small s. Because Salafi is an act of returning back what the forefathers, pious forefathers did. There is no escape. If you are having a faith tradition, you've got to go back to that tradition. There's no way out of this. Obviously, when you go back, you could find different things. That's why it's a small s, not a big s as a movement. But we cannot avoid bracketing, right, our here and now, opening ourselves to the past, the inheritance. Without understanding the heritage, we can't really shape a new future with that value system. So an act of return is an original state, returning to an original state with the view of authentically expressing it new, fresh. This is the essence of really Tajdid. So it is, Tajdid at the very center of human creation. We all obviously go through changes as human beings. It's also in nature itself. So nature changes, but for example, seasons. Although I know in Southeast Asia, sometimes you have only 2 seasons, but usually we have 4 seasons. But this repetition is crucial. It is not like an act of recycling, mindless recycle. It's not like this. It's, all seasons, yes, they do repeat themselves, but as you know, all seasons are different. Like all individuals are different. So the act of repetition is not a really simple-minded reproduction of the same. This is just impossible. Therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كُلُّ يَوْمٍ فِي شَأْنٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continuously creates. Every day is a new creation. And this creation could be jadid. Even resurrection, it is going to retain who we are, but khalq jadid, a new creation. So that, remember the famous hadith, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, says, an old lady, you can't go to Jannah. Ajuz, isn't it? And she's very upset. How come she is not going to go to Jannah? So you won't go as an old lady. You will be restored, right? Young. You can see Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has pedagogies of humor, teaching through humor. So therefore, we should not mistaken. This is not a mindless act of repetition. So it requires critical rethinking because it assumes we have something going wrong. If we honestly don't acknowledge what is wrong, there is no chance you can actually repair it. So therefore, criticality is essential to keep it. And then obviously, applications we have to assess. Finally, a caring, creative restoration. How do we bring that vision to guide us today? If Islam created a civilization, why is it today we're unable to? If Muslim institutions in medieval Baghdad created minds like Imam Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, I don't know, in Syria, why is it today we are unable to produce such creative minds? So reconnect with the heritage so that it could actually speak us today. It could shape our future. So Tajdid could be a personal act of renewing your Iman. Remember, Iman increases and decreases. Precisely because Iman is a human affair. It's not an external, simply gift bestowed upon you. It is what you do with it. So therefore, Tajdid is a personal as well as social reform. And it requires you placing yourself within a tradition. It cannot be a literal replication or recycling. It is not a pessimistic, apocalyptic messianism. I won't go into this big word that is somehow, everything is negative and we are going to have someone going to save it. It's not really like this. If you look at the Quran has this sense of urgency, immediacy of end point, very urgent. But once Islam becomes an ummah, a society, the entire tone of the Quran changes. The social teachings become positive. And human creativity, human capacity for meaning, for creating just societies becomes actually a positive future. So this is really, within the Abrahamic tradition, this is kind of a misunderstood concept, worked well in Christian tradition, but in Islam, the Tajdid is not really a pessimistic act, it's a positive act of empowerment, searching for a better future, essentially. So ontologically and epistemologically, apologies for these big words, we got to obviously understand that there is this Tajdid, in a sense, in the fabric of universe. That is nature of reality and the way in which we make sense, the knowledge. So there is always regression and there is always possibility of change. And essentially, reinterpretation becomes a constant effort. Therefore, education makes an important point. If you don't have a good dynamic education infrastructure, how you are going to maintain that dynamism? Therefore, really, people ask why Muslim Ummah lost its glory. Well, they always go to politics, economics, and other reasons. But to me, as an educator, I think it is the loss of a dynamic, creative education infrastructure that actually is the cause of this problem. So we've got to really rebuild education if we're interested in reclaiming the glory of Islam today. I won't go into... No, in this sense, actually, Tajdid is not new. It is inbuilt, as I said, in Islam. In Islam, Tajdid is the mechanism by which Islam regenerates. It is meaning for different generations. So, prophecy, prophetic office is really intervention in human history in order to actually get it back to the right path. So, Muhammad ﷺ says, isn't it? I am not an innovator in terms of prophecy. Bid'an min ar-rusul. The word bid'ah, as you can see, is a contrast. In a sense that Muhammad ﷺ has not brought anything new in this sense. He just wanted to remind humanity what they have lost. And what is that? The Quran presents itself the perfect embodiment and the last complete expression of the divine message. which was shared with humanity countless times. What makes our mission and vocation very important, it is the last complete expression of it, perfect expression of it. Therefore, education is the key to keep that regeneration going. And we do have this sense in all Abrahamic traditions. Remember the creation, and then humanity goes wrong, and sometimes humanity actually turns their hearts into stone. So it is very famous, even in the old Hebrew Bible, there is the expression, God creates new hearts in order to be able to, for that nation to perceive God properly. This is Zulkifl, Prophet Zulkifl, alayhi salam, and in the Old Testament, Ezekiel is the first great expression of Tajdid inbuilt. And of course, we know that flood, Nuh alayhi salam, his experience is another Tajdid of creation. But this time, it takes a different form. So in other words, Tajdid is really at the very heart of monotheistic faith tradition. It's the educational mechanism by which God reminds humanity they should really return, the word would be tawbah, and of course, find the problems and then put them into the right path. So that makes Tajdid not a legal concept, by the way. So far, as you can see, it is the very fabric of human faithfulness. In this sense, it's an educational concept. It's a pedagogical practice. It's a divine pedagogy, actually. So it's a critical engagement to rethink of the Muslim tradition, to express Islamic values, new, fresh in our personal lives, as well as inspires us to form an Islamically meaningful, just new world. But really, our ambitions should be larger than that. So that is Tawbah Tazkiyah. I won't go into details. And you can see Tajdid, although it's a return, but it's a future-oriented enterprise. Education makes sense if positive change is possible. If change is not possible, then obviously why do we bother even to engage in education? It's a future-oriented, and the idea is how does tradition authoritatively guide us? Of course, the question would be, what is the tradition? How do we know? These are all part of the rethink, criticality, evidence-based thinking. Otherwise, every sub-tradition will claim they have the story, but that is really not the way forward. So I'll just give you a simple example why the Quran is a transformative education, and the personal tajdid is one of the key features of its goals, educational goals. I won't expect you to read all of this stuff, but you can read this article. The article is called Love of Learning in Islam. And you cannot understand education without understanding human development. Here we have a picture of how Quran sees human nature, fitra, developmental terms that has a positive and negative ends, dynamic process of becoming a mature human, or sadly a process of becoming dehumanized, right? And you all know the vocabulary, isn't it? The famous Quranic verses that describes this process, nafs, isn't it? And that it has stages of development, nafs lawama, nafs mutma'inna. So you can see personal renewal is at the very heart of the Quranic project. And it's such a complex project. And I call this human development within the Quranic anthropology, psycho-spiritual vocabulary, and critical pedagogy. All of these are actually brought together. That makes sense because the Quranic intervention is to change humanity. But for this, the Quran, 13 years, deals only with one person, initially Muhammad ﷺ, and then a few other companions of him. Because the task of changing one person is so difficult. As educators, we all know this. And once you've created a model, then it could be replicated across different contexts. Okay, so I won't go into details. I don't know how much time I've got. Timekeeper, please. Time Lord, what do they call it? I have... Oh, I've got plenty of time, okay. Including QA. Okay, 20 minutes then. Now, there is obviously a typology of Tajdid. There's a politics of revivalism, reformist discourse. I want to go into that detail. But roughly, I give you a map. This is like outside our discussion. There is obviously, because the Tajdid is in the Quran itself, in the Hadith itself, we have Tajdid being kept alive, pre-modern context. Look, Imam Ghazali, look, Ibn Taymiyyah, look, Ibn Khaldun. These people actually, they lived particularly Ghazali, lived in the flourishing time of Islam, 10th, 11th century. Yet he problematized ilm. The way ilm really could be substituted with education in this sense. It's not simply religious knowledge as such, although it's called Ihya Ulumuddin, but essentially is to revive what is knowledge for. If the knowledge is not creating people that are Rabbani, Kunu Rabbaniyin, as you know, those who are able to embody the values, ilm becomes vehicle for other purposes than pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the critique begins where education loses its purpose. And Ghazali recognizes this very early on. Therefore, he critiques. Although, strangely, all his life was in a paid sort of context. He was paid by the government to actually run institutions. And then he went, obviously, had a seclusion, spiritual crisis. But not many people know he didn't end up in a zawiyah. He went back to university and actually taught, continued teaching, continuing dealing with people. So, in a way that even he problematized ilm. And of course, Ibn Khaldun's critique is devastating because he says in his time, 14th century, madrasas actually lost their purposes. Too much, really, what we call today, mindless repetition, and endless commentary books, and you never have a chance to look at the essence of what you are learning. His critique is really quite modern, in fact. And not many Muslim educators actually read in that way, sadly. So Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah is nothing but really a critique, educational critique, but also a way forward, how education could be a way forward for Islamic civilization to reclaim its glory. So we have later on, so the critique is onto-epistemic, ontological, epistemological, and ethical. Because Ghazali says, knowledge lost its ethical purpose, serving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now we have obviously colonial context, post-colonial context, and continuing coloniality, sadly, we are dealing with. And that created different types of tajdeeds, I would say. There is traditionalism. I won't go into details. Most of the transnational Islamic movements of the post-colonial period are really traditionalists in the sense of they assume that they have, in their own tradition, somehow the essence retained and you just have to replicate this. That is the mindset. We have neo-traditionalism, those who recognize that it actually can't work, really. The word yesterday we heard from Professor Abdullah, appropriation. They realize that traditionalism is really has a literalism attached to it. That could be, a problem. You can't be literalist. You can't really replicate because the change is so dramatic. You have neo-traditionalists. This could be Salafi leaning or Sufi leaning. It doesn't really matter in that sense. And that in our field, a great figure from Malaysia, he's still with us, I believe, Naqib al-Attas, Jazallah Khair. He is the kind of key figure who gave us a form of tajdid after 1979, which is really a kind of a perennialist philosophical exercise in terms of articulating Islamic educational values within perennialist philosophy. Obviously, this is a claim. You may challenge that, but I think he's a key figure in our field to be a new traditionalist. His right, wrong is another story. Obviously, we have another map, Islamic modernism. That begins with Afghani, Abdu, in India, of course, Rahmat Khan, and Fazlur Rahman lately. So that Islamic modernism is a bit different. And then we have Islamic modernist kind of inspired reforms. The key figure I can see is Ibn Ashur, his Maqasid. We have heard yesterday again. It's a legal concept, actually. And it's a kind of a revival of legal knowledge, Sharia in the sense. So he would be kind of influenced by Abdu, but return back to tradition in a way. And obviously, last but not least, the black sheep, I say, the secular modernists, who also claim that they are doing reform. But obviously, they are kind of outside, really, the Islamic framework, sadly. Okay, now let's come back to, if we understand the Tajdid is a creative pedagogic educational concept that we have to observe in our personal and social activities. How do we get this Islamic school leadership to actually embed this Tajdid spirit in whatever they do, their governance, their ethos, and their practice? Now, obviously, this requires an inquiring, reflective, transparent, accountable governance. I know it's easy to say, difficult to see in the real life, but that is what is really required in a way that we should have authorities to guide us, But we have these authorities to be authoritatively guiding us, not authoritarian in a way, i.e. open to criticism, open to accountability. And I call second part of the Islamic schooling really network they should do, in my view, is to institute ummatic education research. That is a research not only confined to their own small little school, but realizing they are part of the wider development. And that sense of ummatic research is the key to actually institutionalize in our little school context. So it's not really praising a bygone old sort of civilization, but how we can bring efforts together to actually reconnect with that spirit of creativity, spirit of actually engagement, and of course, Tajdid. So in a way, also the Islamic schooling really, particularly those in Islamic schooling, they should really realize these previous models of Tajdid in our tradition, where we can really learn from their experiences, like Ghazali, Ibn Khaldun's experiences. And obviously, much recent developments, like India has got Aligarh, Nadwa, Deoband, and of course, I am very keen on particularly the Indonesian experience. Indonesia, with all due respect to South Asian colleagues, has a really traditional Islamic education infrastructure that actually retained its originality in many ways, compared to like Turkey, for example, where I am originally from, and developed that to the point that they kept the traditionalism, pesantren, pondok pesantren, but also they have a modern Islamic schools where we have an integrated curriculum. And I really like to see more delegates to GIS from Indonesia, and if possible to, in fact, invite them to join GIS, inshallah, to share their experiences. Okay, so the nature of crisis, I don't want to tell you because you are all part of these setups. You know the crisis more than I do. You know what kind of crisis is facing Islamic schooling. We need to appreciate, obviously, the challenges of the post-colonial Muslim world, the even harsher conditions facing Islamic schooling in post-Second World War migration. Our communities are poor, economically, obviously in need, finances are a big problem. I appreciate all of that, definitely. But none of this should really stop Islamic schools to ask the fundamental questions. You know, what is our self-understanding we have? What are we trying to do? And how we can make this much more meaningful. You know, to what extent we understand what education is in Islam. Remember, if you are facing a crisis, you enter into a survival mode. Fifth generation Islamic schooling, we can no longer be in the surviving mode. We got to have a confidence to be able to come out of the survival mode, particularly in the minority context, and to present different models, creative models of schooling, Islamic schooling, and how we can actually get this happening. So Islamic schooling should not be simply places isolated where they believe they simply retain, replicate identity narratives borrowed from the heritage of the parents. This cannot be the only goal. It cannot open up students to the complexity of Islamic tradition. And that is obviously not possible anyway. Look at your own families, mashallah, all you know, have got children maybe. Look how children are different from us. There's no way ethically we can simply impose what we borrowed from, I don't know, Turkey, I don't know, Pakistan, India, upon the, or in Germany, young people's lives. So we've got to ask what kind of education could be attractive to our young people that would inspire them to have an interest in their heritage, to retain that sense of belonging. And hopefully, our task should be to create effective teaching of Islam, critical Islam literacy. Islamic schools do everything perfect. I know from UK, we have, mashallah, star academies, you may know, brilliant network of schools. When you go and visit the schools, they are brilliant in science and, as you know, in social sciences, in physical sciences. When it comes to teaching Islam, there's no really much evidence the way actually Islam is being communicated to young generation in terms of creating Islam literacy. Our task primarily is to make sure young generations have access to Islamic knowledge, that is curriculum, pedagogic creativity, assessment, whatever you call it. So what I will say is, sadly, borrowing a term from legal studies, we have a teaching and learning culture that is based on taqlid, you know, preserving, stagnated, sadly. That's my assessment. It may be wrong. You may have an ijtihadi learning and teaching culture, but from the research we did, it is usually taqlid, and taqlid requires tajdid. But the problem is, how do we do that? A tajdid embedded educational intervention. How does actually we can develop this? Very briefly, the first thing is the problem of method. Literature on Islam education, Islamic education, sadly lacks methodic thinking. This is my charge. I'm happy to stand to be corrected if people charge this. Read those who write on Islamic education as maybe classical Islamic scholars sometimes, or sometimes education experts with no Islamic knowledge. The result is a terrible mismatch where we have improvisations. So we need a method to be able to help us to understand what education is in Islam, how do we discern these educational values, pedagogic practices. Without this method, how could you be sure what we are doing is a prophetic pedagogy, for example? It won't be as simple looking at the hadith, reading Abu Ghudda's book, and then saying, I am doing prophetic pedagogy. It's not like this, much more complex than that. So we need an educational reading of our heritage. Islamic.Network should promote not a legal reading, a theological reading, philosophical reading. Yes, these are interesting, but we need educational reading. We need to really produce educational philosophers in Islam, essentially. That is the first critical task waiting for us. I understand that we need to be activists as well, but activism without thinking ideas, it will create an anti-intellectual mode, which is a charge against Islamic schools, sadly. So we need to avoid that we are not anti-intellectual. In fact, we are spaces where young people experiment with new ideas to be able to find a way out of the ummah. Right, so I want to go into details. Without such thinking of Islam educationally and education Islamically, which is not meant to be a puzzle, by the way, it's not a loss, we cannot really discern authentically what education is in Islam and what is the purpose. Without method, there is no really arrival of secure knowledge. So obviously we have, sadly, lack of empirical research. Without understanding what is wrong with evidence, obviously we can't develop interventions. So that is a big problem. And the remaining parts of my talk, which is like, what, 10 minutes? Time Lord. 15 minutes. I'm doing very well. I'm impressed with my performance. Okay, so I see my own involvement in Islamic education really as a longitudinal action research. So I call this really creating values of Tajdid through action research framework. And those who are familiar with education research, they would immediately know what I mean. Isn't it? That is practitioners who are able to identify what is strong, what is lacking strength, and finding the weaknesses to be able to address them via a rigorous research. So identify the problem, have evidence, develop intervention. You should be creative. What is your intervention? It cannot be simply, inspirational talk. This is where the word inspiration loses its meaning. It is not simply inspirational stuff. It's got to be real, genuine expertise. We've got to encourage specialism in education sources, for like curriculum, assessment. They require expertise. So with this expertise, we should be able to actually experiment with interventions, and then we should test whether the interventions work. Okay, I teach Quran. Why is it that young people don't develop Quranic literacy? What is the problem? Is it the language? Is it the teacher? Materials? Assessment, right? You got to have an inbuilt research. And then you could say, well, I could do things different. Yes, there's a space for hafs. Yes, maybe there's a space for tadabbur, reflection. How could I encourage young people to retain the knowledge, but also to also reflect on it? As you know, at the age of AI, memorization, retention of knowledge, loss, it is all power. But remember, AI can never replace learning by heart. So hafs is really not a simplistic retention of knowledge. Hafs means protecting. What do you protect? Something you value. Hence, learning by heart. Learning by heart is a human activity. It shapes who you are. So AI will never be able to venture in that pedagogic space. So we don't need to go what AI does best, repeat mindless retention of knowledge. We need to create spaces for young people to actually embody, learn by heart. Hence, in oral cultures, this concept makes sense, because in the oral cultures, there is no written image guiding you. Everything is your own imagination. Your heart is where your spirit actually drives you. And this is what really we need to retain in our heritage, learning by heart, not mindless memorization. So my own particular research was based on, initially, really a curiosity to find out how different Islamic education activities essentially shape identity of the learners. That was my basic question. So without judging A is right, B is wrong, I wanted to find out what is the real impact, ultimately, of these Islamic education activities, mosque, madrasa, Islamic school, Darul Uloom, they end up with. So we developed a psychosocial measurement to understand the attitudes, the knowledge, and then to assess, because it's a psychological activity. This is where psychology comes into it in my own research. So I'll just show you the basic measurement. Those who have read or seen me talking, is a really very basic measurement of personality development, particularly within the adolescent stage where identity takes place. I won't going to go to details. The idea is any education, right, when it has been essentially put forward, it will shape the learners in several categories or modes. So in our case, I was interested to find out how Islamic knowledge and values are actually ending up in the life of the young people. So for this identity, you need to look at sense of commitment. Commitment is a psychological process. To what extent what we teach ends up for young people to be an area of commitment. We get them committed. But this commitment sometimes could be foreclosed. It will be because of fear of teacher, I don't know, the fear of tradition, the parents. It is internalized, retained knowledge. It creates a commitment you can observe outwardly in the dress, practice of Islamic rituals. But when you ask why you are a Muslim, you struggle to explain. This is where that commitment becomes a foreclosed psychologically. It doesn't empower the learner. And of course, once the authority is disappeared, it also disappears. And then we have the opposite end, people who are not interested. They go to mosque, madrasa, they realize they can't cope with this. This is kind of a dismissive attitude. That is diffusion. And that is obviously the category where we encourage young people to be inquisitive, exploratory, being able to raise questions, reflect on it. With a little knowledge, they should be able to actually think on that knowledge, not to make them all very big knowledgeable. So if young people, at the end of your teaching of learning Islam, are able to say, well, actually, I really want to find out more about this. I learned about the Quran, Hadith. That is the beginning of psychological exploration. That is a really personally organized way of learning, we call it, in psychology. And this framework has obviously Western ideas, but also, crucially, Islamic psychological concept that I've really worked out on this model. Now, let me go back to one back. Sadly, the results were overwhelmingly within the context I was working. Islamic education was producing foreclosed mindsets. This is obviously an analysis you may challenge. This has been almost 15 years. I haven't seen any study challenging my empirical findings, by the way. So it is obviously an empirical finding. You could always deconstruct it. And last year, one of my PhD students from Turkey, he has actually conducted a replica study of he wasn't very mujaddid, he just replicated my methods to actually test what I found, my hypothesis. And in England, we found almost similar profile of young people, despite 15 years change. You can see, sadly, our Islamic education setups are still producing overwhelmingly foreclosed mindsets. Now, that is a pedagogical gap, obviously. Where do we start? For me, obviously, I'm not a psychologist. I'm an educator. I want to see young people make sense of Islam in today's world to shape their future. So without psychological assessment, I wouldn't know where they are going. And the result was to develop an intervention. How do you intervene? I thought if I work with teachers, they are the best. Because if you're going to get a teacher facilitating role, then the chances are this teacher will actually become an exploratory teaching of learning Islam in her whole class. Right, Brother Anwar. Where is Brother Anwar? He is my PR, ex-colleague from CUBE, Islamic Foundation years. So Brother Anwar has got books actually outside. To my surprise, I thought people have already burned this book. There's nothing left to pass on. But he has some books. Those who are interested, you can read this book and obviously look at the empirical data, and particularly chapter 7, where I reconstruct what education is in Islam after this empirical study. And these are the kind of courses we teach out of these exercise, professional development courses. And our latest initiative is to create a research-based space for Islamic education as part of education sciences, but also a teacher training, Muslim teacher qualification framework. And for this, obviously, we really need Islamic schools cooperation, because we can't develop this unless we have practicing schools where candidates could actually be teaching or being monitored, creating a portfolio. So this IPGCE is a well-established Warwick teacher training program, and finally we have secured that Islamic education could be part of it. We have some discussions with Sister Ainur from Australia. MashaAllah, they are pioneering. Maybe we could have some creative collaboration with other Islamic schools where we can enter into an experiment to create a recognized international Muslim teacher education qualification, inshallah. And we have research, of course, PhDs, you can follow. And actually, I haven't defined why I believe tarbiyah is caring, compassionate transformation. And you all know the word tarbiyah comes from Arabic, Rabba yarbu, Rabbiya yarbu, and Rabba yarubu. There are three possible etymologies, verbal noun. It means to grow, increase, to nurture, but also to care and reform, aslaha. There's a very famous scholar, Abdurrahman Albani. This is not the great Albani, a Syrian scholar, Abdurrahman Albani, who used to teach in Saudi. He has a book called Madkhal ila Tarbiyah. I also recommend you to read that book chapter where he explains this. Essentially, tarbiyah is an act of nurture, development, done with care and compassion. So tarbiyah, by definition, is a learner-led process. Tarbiyah cannot be teacher-centered. Ta'aleem can be teacher-centered. But it is not a simplistic process of nurture. It is a learner-led. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls himself Rabbul Alameen, the educator of all worlds. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's link with humanity is not tahkim, judgment, is not simple judging around. It's actually other way around. It's rububiyyah, as the classical scholar says. Rububiyyah is an educational concept. That means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cares for his creation. Those who believe, those who don't believe. Doesn't really matter. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cares for creation, and the prophetic office becomes a critical intervention, educational intervention, to always remind people. Being a murabbi, therefore, it means being a teacher, assuming learners to be at the forefront of your activity. I won't go into details because this is linked in Arabic with the concept of rabab, which means clouds, and the clouds are having educational character because they bring water that nourishes vegetation. If our teaching and learning is not nourishing minds, it is really not an education. Rabab means this cloud. So murabbi is just like, as we say, cloud. We are facilitators. See, so far, none of this is a borrowing from the Western vocabulary. But obviously, ultimately, the success is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And here, we need to really remind ourselves, we can only deliver this learner-led education philosophy with the view that they could produce renewed confidence, renewed sense of vocation to be able to shape a future. But obviously, hidayah is always in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As a famous Arabic, if I could remember, short poetry says, إذا أنت لم يخلق سعيدا من الأزل, if you are not created at the very beginning a happy person, فخاب مربي, so that means your murabbi actually will fail. وخاب المؤمل, the expectation will all be devastating and disappointing. Why? Because it says, موسى الذي رباه جبريل كافر وموسى الذي رباه فرعون مرسل. You know, in our Islamic tradition, we have two Musas. Musa ibn Imran, Musa alayhi salam, who grew up in the household of Fir'aun, became a Rasul, Tarbiyah. But we have a Musa, this is Samri, Musa ibn Zafar. He, unfortunately, was educated by Jibreel, but that Tarbiyah delivered, sadly, negative outcomes. Not all tarbiyah is the right tarbiyah. Don't fool yourself. Don't go with this nice, comforting, moral vocabulary of deception. Not all tarbiyah is positive. You got to be critical tarbiyah. Otherwise, we will end up, la samahallah, God forbid, this Musa as-Samiri. Musa alladhi rabbahu Jibril kafir. Wa Musa alladhi rabbahu Fir'aun mursal. And by ending my talk, I pray Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us deliverer of the critical tarbiyah, where we nourish hearts, minds, physical body, in the hope that we continually become part of personal, individual renewal, also renewing a new sense of purpose for our global ummah. The world, more than any other time, requires such an intervention. And Allah, I pray Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that all of our efforts are geared into facilitate, as murabbis, facilitate such an internal meaningful change that also has become a model for the external world to emulate and achieve, inshallah, peace, serenity, and justice and dignity for all. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Shaheen. We'll take questions now. We have a mic on my right side and my left side for the ladies. If you have any question, if you have any comment, please go ahead. Meanwhile, while you think about the question and the comment, there was, Dr. Shaheen, there was one concept that you mentioned here, and that is something very relevant, and that is something that we've talked before as well. Educating Islamically and Islamically educating.
Yeah.
So how do we differ between the two?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Jazakallah khair. It's the real essence of what I am trying to say, because every effort to reconstruct education sadly could have two possible outcomes. Those who are influenced by the West, they will simply be assimilated into Western educational vocabulary. That is really, obviously, could be interesting exercise. You can take education and look at John Dewey, Paulo Freire, I don't know, all, you name it, democracy and education. So defining education from our perspective as Muslim educators is not enough. We got to understand, though, how education is analyzed. What is our key vocabulary of education? What does really education actually mean in the first place? Without clarity of what education is, the chances are we could end up being educators for the wrong purposes, doing wrong purposes. Now, that stage is not enough. So we got to reflect on what education is, how does it work in our communities, what kind of interest it serves, right? Politics of education is always there. What does it deliver? And how could we define different aspects of education? But then we go to the next stage where we say, how could we Islamically define education? This is the whole exercise becomes very exciting, at least with my students, as Fahad would know. The 3-4 sessions is all about this, and we'll have a lot of clashes, because this is where, sadly, we require Islamic knowledge. If you don't know Arabic, the chances are, sadly, it will be difficult, because the key concepts are in Arabic. You will be depending on that third and fourth, source. We can't be creative. So how do we make education Islamically meaningful, defined, requires what is called theology of education. You got to go to Quran and Sunnah, Hadith, Islamic tradition, models. You have to see what is the Islamic vocabulary. And then you could define education Islam. Is education ilm? Is education ihsan? Is education adab? Right? Is education tazkiyah? What is the shumuli? What is the inclusive meaning of education in Islam? This is theology of education. You really need your theology, your Islamic knowledge. And this is where literature is full of, sadly, errors, misunderstandings, completely. Based on the third and fourth authorities, people define education in Islam. Never saying, look, this could be wrong. Being pious is not a valid reason to be a good scholar. It's an outcome. Scholarship requires critical scrutiny. And therefore, we need to have this circle completed to understand what education is, and then to understand how education is defined in Islam. Because if we don't do the second one, we will be buying into secular framework, sadly, which we want to avoid.
Thank you. We'll have the question from the ladies' side first. Sister Salatu, please.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Walaikum salam.
First, Jazakallahu khairan. Thank you very much. I found your session to be a breath of fresh air. A lot of the discourse around Tajdid I have found to be rather limiting, constraining, restricting, and I had begun to feel a sense of frustration. But this session has helped to open it up a lot more. That Tajdid should open up, not close us in. My question is this. You made a statement about the need to create educational philosophers.
Yes.
And I wondered, how exactly do we go about that? I know that's probably another day's worth of lectures, but is there a short answer you can give? Particularly, now I want to speak contextually, if you are in a context where you do not have the financial resources to send people on in-depth courses, immersive learning, but you want to try to tilt your teachers and your staff towards educational philosophy. We know not everyone will end up becoming a philosopher, but enough tilt to make them become more effective at raising the next generation of Muslims.
Yes, absolutely. Jazakallah khair, sister. This is exactly the point. We have poverty of educational creativity in our communities. We can't assume what we are doing is the authentic version. Benefit of doubt. How do we know something is authentic, not authentic? Based on knowledge, research, expertise. Exactly. In fact, the problem begins, as you know, education is like delegated to a first level priority, sadly. You know, isn't it? In families, you all know your bright child will go to medicine, I don't know, engineering, and of course your child who is less promising will end up in, I don't know, education, and then if he's completely not really intellectually competent Islamic education. Sadly, this is the reality. We have to change the attitude of our parents, first of all. Second, yes, of course, without financial benefit, how could you pick up bright minds? We've got to have an egalitarian system of scholarships. Islamic Development Bank, where are they? I spent years communicating with Islamic Development Bank. Sadly, this is like we're all family now, an internal critique. I couldn't get them to really focus on and listen to what I was trying to say. We've got to create the distinctive scholarship for education in Islam, creativity, philosophically, practically. It's all Islamic studies, Islamic economics. We are Islamic economics, 3 decades Islamic economics, and we have no evidence that that has done anything really to pull us out of poverty. Please, you are absolutely important. We need to get our funding bodies to recognize crucial importance of a selective process to fund scholarships for those who are going to be experts on Islamic education. Now, here you can't be really a philosopher of education unless you have ilm, Islamic knowledge. Ideally, I would say it's a difficult dual task. Islamic education and philosophy requires genuine Islamic knowledge. You've got to go to Sharia studies, Ilahiyat, we call it in Turkey, for example, and then you've got to move on to education studies, combine them both. Your major has to be Islamic Sharia studies and education sciences, and then maybe psychology, maybe curriculum development. So you're absolutely right. None of our organizations, maybe it's not deliberate, they always kind of put education and investment at the last. So we hope that inshallah we will get dedicated scholarships. In my experience, although I failed with Islamic Bank, the Islamic Bank of Development, but I was fortunate with small British Muslim trusts. These families who are part of, obviously, migrating communities, they understand without education you can't retain sense of identity across different continents in your own family. And education is the only place where you can retain that lineage and heritage. So we hope, inshallah, sister, we create more scholarships dedicated to Islamic education, educational philosophy in Islam, inshallah.
Thank you. Can we have a question from this side?
Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah, please go ahead.
A lot of emphasis is being laid upon the word Tajdid. And yesterday we have been given a detailed explanation by Professor Abdullah, mashallah. I think one example is enough. We have Mujaddid al-Fisani, rahmatullahi alayh, Ahmad Sarhindi, who was given this title because he opposed heterodox movements, right, such as Deen-e-Ilahi. So, I know a minute minority of ulama is here. I don't think they are going to raise any objection on this word particularly. But I'm still wondering that what do you mean by the word tarbiyah? How could you sum up, and how could we implement this tarbiyah in our institution? And where should we initiate from? This is my question. Thank you.
That's a very good question. Yeah, that requires tajdid. That requires a renewed effort, a renewed way. How do we get this dynamic, compassionate, transformative, flourishing, we call tarbiyah, to guide our educational practice? You see, if you do simply say, okay, just follow, it won't work. But if you're an educational expert, you will say, right, let me educationally organize my curriculum, my teaching and learning methods, my ethos. See, with this, you are actually renewing the creative, dynamic, compassionate, transformative flourishing with your expertise to a renewed mode to actually find its way to guide you. So tajdid is really misunderstood. It's not always innovation in the legal sense. That is the problem. Maqasid is very good. Maqasid, we don't want to really criticize, but it is terribly legally framed. Purposes of education. Well, you got to understand what education is first in order to be able to understand what the purposes is. Sharia, legal hermeneutics is different than educational thinking. So, tajdid is really willingness to be able to rethink outside the box, if you like it, in education spaces, to experiment with new things, to be able to obviously achieve the outcome. In our case, expertise in education sciences is crucial to be creative, to be mujaddid. We don't want to obviously renew and remember, it's not an bid'ah, it's not an innovation. It is the way in which we could creatively express this concept to guide our effort today. That requires creativity, rethinking. You can't simply emulate what you've been given. If it was working, there wouldn't be no need anyway, right? So tajdid has different levels, right? And sometimes tajdid, as we said, requires a group effort, collective effort. You can't really do on your own this stuff. Therefore, GIS for me is really embodying this kind of tajdidi renewal, essentially thinking, because it's bringing all the practitioners together to be able to find, honestly, ways forward. Problems that we are all sharing, right? And we want to find a way. We need more such as ulama. Imam Nawawi recognizes this, that mujaddid is no longer one person to solve everything, messianic. It's a really group activity. In our field is education. It is nothing to do with Sharia rules themselves. It's the way in which we communicate Sharia. You make people understand Sharia today. And of course, produce a model within the Sharia values. Okay, you call them maqasid, fine. But maqasid is terribly, legally bound concept, sadly. So we've got to come out of that legal mentality, because education is broader than legal thinking. And of course, in Islam, Islam is not confined to only legal thinking. Even Sharia itself, as you know, is an ethical concept. To be able to go to the origin of values. Sharia is spring, essentially. Literally, when you're in the desert, you need water, you are thirsty. When you go and find this spring, how happy you are. Sharia are meant to be like this, core values that makes you a better human being, makes you live in prosperity, in happiness, and of course in complete Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rida. So the point is, tajdid begins with tajdid of uqul, our minds, and then expertise, and then of course collectively sharing that to be able to produce a big impact. And of course for this we've got engagement, different levels. So we've got to reconfigure tajdid within education spaces.
Inshallah. Thank you. We'll take one question. We have 3 questions, so we'll finish with 3 questions, inshallah. Please.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Jazakallah khair. What you have done today with the presentation is amazing. I have one answer and one question. The answer to the sister and to you about the scholarship is that we need to establish the awqaf. As yesterday Professor Abdullah mentioned, we've got to establish the awqaf back in order to allow us to move forward with our ideas and to move forward with all this beautiful work that everybody is doing. And the question is, Professor, I have for you is, I come from UK and top Islamic schools teaching the teachers. But we have so many teachers, Muslim teachers and non-Muslim teachers in state schools.
Yes.
So how we can tap to those teachers in state schools, to the Muslim ones, and Muslim ones, so we can give them the correct idea about Islam. So whenever they approach our children and they're teaching, so they can teach appropriately. Thank you.
Very good point. Jazakallah khair. Yes. Well, first of all, obviously, brother is a bit shy, humble. He's running, obviously, a waqf, alhamdulillah. So we got one answer actually already in this sense. I agree, inshallah. So we expect you to sponsor sister to have a PhD in Islamic education, inshallah. We got your commitment now, okay? This is all
agreed, inshallah.
Inshallah. Yeah, you are absolutely right. In the UK, of course, in diverse contexts, we have Islam taught in mainstream schools. We have Muslim teachers. It's unfortunate that we haven't encouraged more Muslim RE teachers in the system. If only we could. This is a big misunderstanding. I don't want to go into it. It's a UK-specific problem. In Europe, it's the same. We have a multi-faith RE in the UK system. Sadly, traditionally, Muslims have been really aloof, distant. But it is a massive problem because we've got to recognize we can't accommodate all of our children in Islamic schools, no matter how much we love Islamic schools. Majority of our kids go to mainstream schools. In the UK, we have a chance to introduce Islam. We have RE, and we really need to encourage teachers, Muslim teachers, to be able to teach Islam authentically. That's a big, big, really need. Also, Islamic education is not confined to faith, from faith to faith. Islamic education is also should be interested in public understanding of Islam. It's an educational task. It is not only Muslims in education, but also how do we encourage better public literacy on Islam itself. Another massive area of really need. We really want to encourage. So Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair. We've lost 3 minutes, inshallah. We'll go with this question and then.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Sahin, for this informative presentation. And I love that you've included the psychological aspect of in your research, because usually it's a point that usually missed out on in the process of choosing a murabbi in our schools and even our homes for our children. The emotional and psychological aspect has been ignored usually. So can you summarize for us a few points, just a simple criteria for choosing a murabbi who has a mujaddid ideology, or a person who can actually become a mujaddid and a murabbi, to guide our educators in their hiring process? Jazakallah khair.
Shukran, Jazakallah khair. Thank you. This is important, really, because our sector is heavily underfunded, sadly, and we are grateful for volunteers. One disadvantage of volunteers is the fact that Islamic education is delivered mostly with volunteers who are unqualified. And that's a massive, massive really problem, because Islamic education should be really delivered by at least qualified, trained people. That means we should be able to obviously get best of our young people to choose teaching as their professional area of development or profession. Now, how do we choose a murabbi? There's, of course, if only we had Islamic teacher qualification framework, clearly the first module would be, on this very concept that we should be able to actually identify people who are suitable to become teachers. Not everybody could be a teacher, right? That's the whole point. In Europe, teaching became a profession. Otherwise, you end up with all kind of problems. So we should develop really, which I believe we developed at Warwick, some basic criteria to be able to get people, ideally, into the teacher training program. And murabbi, you have to look at the degree to which this person has a nature, real by person, to be able to communicate, social, has a nature that is actually conducive for teaching. You can't have somebody who is introverted, right, completely, to be at the forefront of teaching. This is just unfair to the person. So we need to develop some sort of a criteria for selection. You are absolutely right. And then subject knowledge, and then generic pedagogic skills. Not only Western pedagogies, we also need to obviously have Islamically embedded pedagogic practices. And in fact, this goes back all the way to the Quranic approach, where teaching is always based on certain authority. Remember the famous story that Harun will remember, we analyzed in our course at Warwick, Khidr alayhi salam and Musa alayhi salam, where a prophet is learning from a knowledgeable person, and the relationship, is based on not simply trust, but a contract, right? So Khidr alayhi salam says, isn't it? Look, you could be a prophet, but you may not be able to cope with what I am going to tell you. We are going to have experiential learning, right? The prophetic office sometimes, isn't it, is different. So how do we do that? We have to make accountability. Ethical values, accountability. Let's make a contract, although Musa alayhi salam sadly violates the contract several times. But you can see in Islam, there is an embedded sense of authoritative, essentially, qualification, which is ijaza. As you know, it became an ijaza. Ijaza is really not but a teaching qualification, although it was originally in hadith, it's terribly hadith framed, but we do have later on development of teaching qualification as ijaza to tadris, for example. So if only we could... Right, okay, that is a sign, Brother Fahad. We should stop. It's a sign from the beyond, from Khidr alayhi salam.
that was exactly at 10:05, so that is a coincidence.
Khidr alayhi salam. So the point is, we do need to have these frameworks and we have a qualification. You're absolutely right. But this cannot be done sitting isolated place in your school. You've got to really work with Faculty of Education, Education Sciences. Islamic Education Studies, therefore, makes sense. It's a new discipline, essentially. One of the tasks is to build up this qualification framework where we have, volunteers, but we select the best who meet this criteria to be able to teach teachers who are, after all, we are going to entrust our children's faith and deen to them and their faith development.
Thank you. We'll take this last question, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakumullah khair for your presentation. My question is derived from an example. The Titanic was a magnificent piece of architecture, and I'm sure that at the time they must have gathered the best engineer and professional team to come up with such a beautiful piece of machinery. But it ended up in the depth of the ocean, right? On the other hand, we have the ship of Nuh alayhi salam.
Yes.
If we can say that was built with little skill and amateur level engineering, but it ended up saving humanity. So my question is, how would you measure this proportion of heavy reliance upon human intellect without divine guidance and absolute reliance upon divine guidance in Islamic education? Thank you.
First of all, there is no success, as we mentioned, without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's blessing. Remember, the tarbiyah could be tarbiyah of Musa, sadly who becomes kafir. The tarbiyah could be a tarbiyah Musa becomes a mursal. We are obliged by Islam, by the Quran, to exert our best. Not to build ships only, but obviously to understand the ocean of life embraces all of us. We have to equip young people as much as we can, but the hidayah, we cannot, nobody can guarantee that. We can only trust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's blessings to guide us, hidayah, and deliver. So our task is, as murabbis, is to facilitate as much as we can. But without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's intervention, blessing, connection with the divine, obviously, it will not deliver the outcome. So by definition, education in Islam is ultimately a spiritual exercise, if you like it. It cannot really avoid spiritual inspiration. Therefore, compassionate transformation comes through that. But even, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as you can see, the Murabbi model, Rabbul Alameen, has some basic conditions. If you are a Murabbi, you should be able to listen, right? You can't exert simply authority. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is limiting His own majestic power to listen to humanity, why not as Murabbis now we listen? Why can't we develop a learner-led Islamic educational process where we actually put our efforts to the enrichment, development of the learner rather than exercise authority? So we have criteria, but ultimately Islamic education, we want to gain Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rida, pleasure. That taqwa, that level of spirituality is obviously another criteria to be in when we select Muslim educators, murabbis. That is taken for granted. So it is not a simple intellectual calculation. Therefore, there is a perfect harmony between heart and mind. And remember, the Quran says, go and investigate the past civilizations. Right? Investigate, the Quran says. So why? What is this exercise for research, study? There's a divine pedagogic outcome, so that وَلْتَكُنْ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا, so that you develop hearts capable of thinking. Right? There is no way you can separate. Therefore, Islam is not meant to be seclusion of an endless theosophic spirituality. Islam meant to be a spirituality that shapes the world, changes us and others. فَلْتَكُنْ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا, so that you develop hearts capable of thinking. If you have a heart not thinking, you haven't achieved what the Quranic education wants to achieve. Jazakumullah khair.
Yeah. One last short question and short response, inshallah, so that we can go for tea.
Assalamu alaikum wa
Alaikum
rahmatullah.
salam.
I don't think that I will get another opportunity to say something very relevant what our Dr. Abdullah Sahin said. That is, belong to the entire conference, what he said, one sentence. That is, he narrated Imam Nawawi, rahmatullahi alayhi. And he has explained in Sahih Muslim, Hadith, La tazalu ta'ifatu min ummati. He narrated about the narration of Imam Nawawi, rahimahullah, who was born in nearly 676. And his very authentic book is Riyadus Salihin, well read globally. Summary, what doctor said, that includes scholars of hadith, muhaddithin, and worshippers, zuhat, and those who enjoy good and forbid evil, and people engage in various form attritis, and they don't have to be in one place. They can be spread across the world. Their presence and steadfastness over time is a miracle and sign of truth of our Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. That this conference, I also got an opportunity, not here. The race goes under member. I presented a presentation. When a person presents, he have a confidence and feel what I am doing is perfect 100%. That is how he presents.
Alhamdulillah.
Thank you.
That is how it goes. But according to Imam Nawawi, we scholars from various parts of the world, intellectuals and professionals and ulama, this is a golden opportunity for the leaders, the people who are responsible for this, to come out with, because everybody what they say, I will have a lot of positive and negative on his presentations. But one person is carrying this, only his presentation, it won't survive for his future. Therefore, it is a good opportunity. Our President Zafar and the team sit, and one day left, as our leaders in the world, Rabita and others, when they gather, they sit 10-15 people and take what are the best of these presentations and put in one paper and have a declaration. It will be very fruitful for the entire, the people who are here, because everybody have their own view and point and interpretation of Quran and Hadith, where certain things we may not agree on that. Therefore, to unite everyone on one page, I will give an example, a common word. Muslims, scholars and Christians, fathers got together and they wrote a document, Ta'alaw ila kalimatin, a common word. This conference must come on a common word which will give the world a best example. This is my humble request. Jazakumullah khair, barak.
Jazakallah khair, Allah Yussalama, Jazakallah khair. Well done. And you are absolutely right. Imam Nawawi reflects on the word in English, in Arabic, man yujaddid. In some narrations, it talks about a man, but actually in the famous narration, it's man. Therefore, sisters, you are part of this. Tajdid, of course, is always, sadly, it's an unspoken reality. It's always male-oriented. It's a group effort, including believing, knowledgeable men and women who are able to actualize this Tajdid. So we have to recognize that within our efforts, we must give a special real space for often sadly excluded the other side of course, these ulama. We need more female ulama who would be able to also go into education and deliver this renewed sense of transformative, compassionate education. So Jazakallah khair for reminding us that.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Sahin.
سعد إلى منتهى